The wind howled like a wounded beast across the snowbound valley, carrying with it the smell of pine pitch and iron frost. The giant rancher swung his axe against a stubborn log, his breath steaming, bare chest glistening with the labor's sweat though the storm gnawed at his skin. He had always met winter head-on, unflinching, letting the cold test his blood. But tonight the storm carried something stranger than hunger or chill. Beneath the rhythm of his work, he heard it, a faint groan, wooden and hollow, like rope stretched taut against flesh. He stilled. The axe slid into the log and stuck fast. His head turned to the dark woods where snow fell heavier, bending branches until they creaked. Again it came, the moan of timber and the muted rasp of human breath struggling where no breath should be. He pulled his coat from the porch rail but did not bother to cover himself fully, only slung it across his shoulders as his long legs carried him into the storm's teeth. Snow blinded, swirling, yet he knew the land by heart. Each step cracked through crust into powder. He followed the sound until he saw them, two shadows swaying from the black skeleton of an oak. His gut clenched. As he came closer, the sight burned through the snow's veil. Two young women, both dark-haired, their bellies rounded with life not yet born, dangled from ropes at their throats. Across their bodies hung a wooden plank scrawled with charred letters. "White man don't forgive." His jaw tightened. Rage flickered hot but steady, it did not shake him. He moved quickly, boots punching holes into the drift. Their heads lolled, lips blue against the storm's white fury. He set his rifle in the snow, reached for his knife, and cut the first rope. Her body collapsed against him, nearly weightless from hunger yet heavy with child. She gasped like a fish pulled back from water, clawing weakly at his arm. He steadied her, lowered her to the snow, then turned to the second. The knife slipped once on the frozen cord, slicing his palm, but he ignored the blood. With a grunt, he severed it and caught her before she hit the ground. Her eyes fluttered half shut, a low moan escaping her cracked lips. Both women trembled, breaths shallow, snow searing their bare feet. He pressed an ear to each breastbone, finding fragile heartbeats drumming like trapped birds. "Easy now," he muttered, voice more to steady himself than them. They did not answer. He pulled the sign from their necks, snapped it in two with his hands, and let the wind scatter its pieces. Then he lifted them, one across each shoulder, giant's burdens carried without question. His muscles knotted, lungs burning, yet he pushed forward through the storm, leaving the cursed oak to stand alone with its broken ropes. The path back seemed longer, swallowed by night. Snow whipped into his eyes, forcing him to bow his head. Their breaths ghosted against his skin, faint but still alive, and that tether drove his legs onward. He reached the cabin, slammed the door wide with his boot, and laid them gently by the hearth. The fire crackled, casting shadows on their bruised faces. He stripped off their frost-stiff garments, wrapping them in wool blankets, then poured water from a kettle and coaxed it between their lips. One coughed violently, chest seizing. He braced her upright, rubbed her back until the spasm eased, then laid her down again. The other stirred, eyes darting open in panic before dulling into wary confusion. She clutched her belly instinctively, as though fearing the child inside would be stolen as cruelly as her breath had almost been. He crouched beside her, his massive frame filling the space, but his touch was gentle as he drew the blanket closer around her shoulders. Silence thickened, broken only by the fire's snap and their ragged breaths. He saw the whip marks etched across their arms, the bruises wringing their throats, and he did not need their words to understand what had been done. He poured broth into a tin cup, lifted it carefully to one's lips. She resisted, then relented, sipping slowly, tears leaking though she made no sound. The other remained limp, but when he brushed damp hair from her brow, her eyelids fluttered in faint recognition of care. His own blood ran warm from the cut across his palm, dripping onto the floorboards. He bound it roughly with cloth, never breaking watch over them. Their presence turned the cabin into something more than timber and fire. It became a fragile refuge defying the cruelty that had hung them like carrion in the storm. Hours passed. Their color returned faintly, breaths deepened, though fear lingered sharp in their eyes when they woke and glanced at him. He did not crowd them with speech. He had lived long enough to know words could be as violent as fists. Instead, he fetched more wood, stoked the fire high, and left the broth where they could reach it. At one point, the nearest stirred again, whispering something in Apache, the syllables trembling like a prayer. He could not understand, yet the cadence spoke of both grief and hope. She pressed her hands over her swollen belly, rocking slightly, whispering still. The other, rousing, reached across the blankets to clasp her sister's hand. Or perhaps friends, kinship written in the mirrored desperation of their eyes. Together they wept silently, breath hitching but faces turned toward the fire, as though afraid to turn from its fragile promise. He watched, unflinching, but a heaviness settled in his chest. He had seen cattle lynched for rustling, men strung for stealing horses, but never women heavy with unborn life used as warnings against mercy. Such evil was not just cruelty, it was a message meant to spread fear. And now that message had reached him. Snow rattled against the shutters, reminding him the storm still reigned. Yet the greater storm would come soon enough, carried not by wind but by men. Whoever had hung them would not leave their cruelty unfinished. He felt it in his bones, the way a rancher feels the weather turning. His jaw set. He knew his hands had bound him now to their survival, and their enemies would see that as a crime. As the fire burned lower and the women drifted into uneasy sleep, he sat at the window with his rifle across his knees, bare chest steaming in the flickering light. Outside, the oak in the distance swayed like a gallows in the wind. He stared into the night, waiting, while the broken sign's words seared themselves into memory. White man don't forgive. Yet within him, a different vow formed, silent but iron-bound. But I will not forget. And when the floor creaked, just once, faintly, he tightened his grip on the rifle, eyes narrowing, for he knew he and the women were not yet alone. The storm raged deep into the night, but within the cabin, firelight carved a fragile sphere of warmth. The rancher moved without hurry yet with purpose, every motion deliberate, as though the smallest misstep might shatter what little safety had been salvaged. The two women lay swaddled in wool, their bodies trembling still though the hearth licked high and hot. Their breaths fogged faintly in the glow, uneven but alive. He fed the fire again, pine resin sparking bright. The smell of smoke mingled with wet leather, broth simmering, and the faint metallic tang of his own blood from the cut across his hand. He ignored the sting. He set a pot of venison stew on the coals, the steam curling like ghostly ribbon toward the rafters. Hunger had a way of deciding whether the weak clung to life or slipped away, and he would not let them starve. When he dipped the wooden spoon, the broth shimmered amber. He crouched near the women, resting the bowl carefully on the floorboards. One stirred. The younger looking of the two, though their ages were likely close. Her eyelids fluttered open, gaze darting toward him like a deer cornered between trees. He lowered his head, softened his shoulders, tried to shrink what could not be shrunk. Still he loomed large, shirtless skin scarred from years of toil and conflict, a figure that could not help but frighten. He lifted the spoon, tilted it gently toward her lips. For a moment, she resisted, jaw tight with mistrust. But the smell coaxed her, and when the first taste touched her tongue, a shudder ran through her frame. She drank, hesitant at first, then more greedily, her hand lifting weakly to steady his. He let her take what she could, then set the cup down. Her companion remained still, eyes closed, but the rise and fall of her chest spoke of endurance yet. He dipped again, leaned closer, and carefully tipped a trickle of broth into her parted mouth. It dribbled down her chin, yet some slid past, and she swallowed reflexively. His heart steadied. He would keep them tethered here, alive, until strength returned. The women did not speak his tongue, or if they could, they held it back like a secret. Their silence was not empty, it was armored. They watched him, eyes shifting when he moved across the cabin. They measured him, waiting to know if the one who cut them down would also cut them deeper. He did not force words. Instead, he let action be his proof. He cleaned their feet, chafed red from frozen ground, with warm cloths dipped in water. He rubbed until circulation returned, until color blushed faintly where death had been gnawing. He mended the rope burns at their throats, binding gently with strips torn from his own shirt. When one flinched at his touch, he withdrew, but when she realized the touch carried no harm, she let him return. Outside, the blizzard clawed at the shutters, rattling iron hinges, but the cabin stood stout. Inside, Shadows bent and stretched across log walls. He worked in silence, glancing now and then toward their faces. Beneath the bruises, he saw youth not yet hardened by years, though hardship had aged their eyes beyond measure. Their bellies shifted occasionally, small movements beneath the blankets, reminders that their bodies carried not one life but two more, fragile flames needing shelter. He thought of his own mother, long gone, who had once said that kindness was never wasted, even if given to a stranger who might spit it back. Her words guided his hands now, even as the storm threatened to erase every good thing. Time crawled. When the firewood stack thinned, he stepped outside, bare skin bitten by wind. Snow whipped like knives, but he hauled in a fresh armload, piling it high. When he returned, the women's eyes followed him, no longer only with fear but with something softer. Curiosity, perhaps, or the fragile recognition that he had not abandoned them to the storm. Later, one stirred again, whispering low in Apache. The syllables rolled like river stones, incomprehensible to him, yet the cadence spoke of longing, maybe gratitude. She pressed her hand against her stomach, eyes damp. He felt the weight of her plea, even without translation. He nodded once, solemn, as if to answer. I hear, even if I cannot understand. The other, still weaker, roused enough to mimic his gesture when he brought the spoon again. She drank, then lifted her trembling hand toward him. Not to strike, not to push away, but to touch. Her fingers brushed the rough bandage across his palm, feeling the wound he had suffered cutting her free. Her eyes lifted, searching his face. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition that his blood had been spilled for theirs. She dropped her hand, but her breathing eased, less panicked than before. The cabin breathed with them. Silence deepened, comfortable now, filled with the crackle of fire, the sigh of snow against glass. He leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving them. He did not sleep, though fatigue pulled at him. They needed a sentinel, and he had chosen the post. As dawn bled pale through frosted panes, the storm's rage softened. Light revealed their faces more clearly. The youth, the bruises, the fragile beauty untouched by cruelty's attempt to erase it. One sat upright slowly, clutching the blanket tight. She studied him. He held her gaze, not challenging, not yielding, simply steady. After a long moment, she dipped her head, the smallest acknowledgement. He returned the gesture, as if a pact had been signed without word or ink. She reached for the cup herself, hand shaking but determined. She drank, then handed it to her companion, guiding it with a care that spoke of sisterhood, or something deeper than simple kin. The act told him more than any tale could. They were not merely survivors of violence. They were guardians of one another, bound not just by blood but by shared endurance. He rose, placed more logs on the fire, and turned to the shutter. The world outside lay buried, white and muffled, yet tracks would not stay covered forever. Men who hung women from trees would not be satisfied to let their prey vanish. He felt it like a tightening in his chest. Danger had only been delayed, not ended. When he glanced back, both women were watching him now. No longer only fear in their eyes, but questions, quiet trust beginning to stir like embers beneath ash. He gave no smile, no false promise. He only drew his rifle closer, propped it against the wall where they could see, and settled into his chair again. The message was plain without words. They were under his roof, and as long as his breath held, no rope would touch them again. But even as the fire burned steady, a sound stirred beyond the cabin walls. Not the storm, not the shifting timbers, but the faint thud of hooves muffled in snow. The storm broke by mid-morning, leaving the land smothered in silence. Snow lay heavy on pine boughs, dazzling white beneath a pale sun. The world looked reborn, yet inside the cabin, the air clung thick with memory and unspoken dread. The women sat near the fire, blankets draped close, their dark eyes fixed on him with caution that had softened into something else, an ember of tentative trust. He moved slowly, making coffee, pouring steaming water over grounds, letting the smell spread through the room. Their gaze followed every gesture, not as though they feared it now, but as though each act carried meaning. When he knelt to set food before them, one of the women finally spoke. Her English was broken, halting, words shaped as if pulled from a hidden place she had not used in years. "You cut us free." Her voice rasped, scarred from rope's grip. She touched her throat with trembling fingers, then looked toward him with a searching expression. He nodded once, sipping from his cup, saying nothing. The other woman, weaker, leaned against her sister's shoulder, her eyes half closed. She whispered in Apache, and the one with English translated softly, choosing words as if each carried weight. We were taken. Trading postmen. They drink. They say, we are their payment. We fight. They beat. They laugh. Her gaze dropped, shame staining her voice though it was not hers to carry. His jaw hardened. The fire snapped in the grate, punctuating her confession. They make us walk, she went on. Far, far. In cold. We fall. They tie us. Say, no one forgive. No one care. Only tree, only rope. Her eyes shimmered wet, but she did not let tears fall. Instead, she drew a slow breath, steadying herself as her sister stirred, pressing a hand against her belly. The unborn shifted within, a fragile protest to the cruelty they had endured. He leaned forward, resting forearms on his knees, gaze fixed steady on her. They won't have you again, he said simply, voice like gravel. For a moment, silence swallowed his words, as though they had landed in soil too barren to grow. Then the woman's shoulders loosened, the smallest sliver of relief creeping into her eyes. She nodded, not fully believing but needing to hold on to the possibility. The day stretched long. He tended the animals, broke ice from the trough, fed the fire until the cabin glowed. Each time he returned, their eyes tracked him, not with suspicion now, but with the quiet awareness of those who know their survival has been tied to another's hands. They began to move about cautiously, one rinsing cloths in warm water, the other brushing snowmelt from the floor with a twig broom he had set aside. Small gestures of dignity, reclaiming themselves from helplessness. That afternoon, he saddled his horse and rode into town, leaving them hidden behind shuttered windows. The settlement was restless with talk, men gathered in the saloon whispering and laughing too loud. Their words reached him even before he stepped inside. Hung him good, left a mark no one will forget, one boasted, slapping the bar. Savages carry savage brats, better they swing now than later. The others laughed, cruel and careless. His hand tightened on the mug of coffee he ordered, knuckles whitening. He said nothing, but every word carved deeper into him. As he left, an old trapper caught his arm, voice low. Careful, boy. Those men ain't finished. They're sayin' someone cut the bodies down. They're huntin' to make it right. He did not answer, only mounted and rode home faster, snow spraying beneath the hooves. When he returned, the cabin smoke curled gentle into the sky. Inside, the women sat quietly, one mending a tear in the blanket with clumsy stitches, the other humming low to the child within her belly. They looked up as he entered, questions hanging in the air, but he gave no report of the poison he'd heard. Instead, he cleaned his rifle, checked the chambers, then sharpened the blade of his axe until it sang beneath the whetstone. The sound filled the cabin with a restless rhythm, a warning made tangible. The women watched him, understanding more than words could carry. The one with English finally said, They come. It was not a question but a certainty, echoing what already sat in his chest. He looked up, met her eyes. Aye. They'll come. Night fell heavy again. The snow outside reflected moonlight, turning the world pale and brittle. Inside, the fire burned hot, but tension curled tighter with every creak of the timbers. The women slept uneasily, one crying out once in her language before pressing close to her sister. He sat at the window, rifle across his lap, ears tuned to every shift of the wind. At dawn, hoofbeats sounded faint through the still air. He rose without a word, stepped outside, and scanned the horizon. A rider approached, hunched against the cold, not one of the settlers but his nearest neighbor, a wiry man with frost in his beard. He reined in hard, breathless. They know it was you, the neighbor rasped. 5 of them. Armed. Drunk enough to be mean, sober enough to shoot straight. They said they'd finish the job tonight, burn your place to the ground if they have to. His eyes flicked toward the cabin door. You best send them women away, else you'll swing with them. The rancher's jaw set, the muscles working like stone beneath skin. "Ain't leavin' them," he said, voice flat as iron. The neighbor shook his head, spitting into the snow. "Then God help you." He wheeled his horse and vanished into the pines. Inside, the women stared at him, having caught enough of the exchange to know the danger. Fear shone bright in their eyes, but behind it, something else flickered. Resolve, fragile yet rising. They had been hunted, hung, humiliated, but they were not willing to bow again. One reached for the rifle leaning near the hearth, her hand trembling. She did not lift it, only touched the wood, then looked at him as though asking if he would let her stand beside him when the storm of men came. He took the weapon from her gently, set it aside, and placed the axe within reach instead. "If it comes to it," he said quietly, "we fight." The wind rattled the shutters. The fire hissed low. Snowflakes drifted past the window like ashes. And from the distance, faint but certain, came the sound of laughter carried on cold air, the laughter of men drawing near. The snow had stilled into a deep crystalline hush by the time the riders came. Moonlight turned the drifts silver, shadows stretched long between the pines. The rancher stood in the doorway of his cabin, broad shoulders bare to the cold, rifle in one hand, axe in the other. His breath rose like smoke in the air, steady and controlled, though the ground itself seemed to pulse with the vibration of hooves. The women hovered behind him, wrapped in blankets, eyes wide but not shrinking. Their bellies shifted with the slow stirring of unborn life, the weight of innocence depending on a single night's survival. One of them touched the rancher's arm lightly, as though tethering him, reminding him that he was not alone. He gave no glance back, but the faintest nod acknowledged the contact. From the tree line, fire bloomed, torches lifted by 5 men, their laughter coarse, cutting through the cold. The settlers dismounted, boots crunching snow, whiskey reeking from their breath. One carried a rope coiled at his side, the same kind that had nearly taken the women's last breath. Another clutched a shotgun, barrel glinting red in the torchlight. "Well, looky here," the leader drawled, voice slurred yet sharp. "Our good Samaritan. Thought you could play savior? Thought you'd spit in the face of justice?" His torch lifted higher, casting the words "white man don't forgive" back into memory. The rancher said nothing. He planted his boots firm in the snow, chest bare, skin steaming in the night air like an animal ready to charge. His silence was louder than their jeers. One of the women whispered in Apache, words quick and breathless. The other pressed her hand against her sister's mouth, silencing her, eyes darting to the rifles. Fear shimmered between them, but so did defiance. They had survived rope and storm. They would not surrender again. The settlers spread wide, circling. Their torches hissed as flakes fell onto flames, spitting sparks. "Hand 'em over," the leader snarled. "They ain't yours. They ain't no one's. They're a warning, and you went and ruined it. You'll pay, boy." The rancher lifted the axe, resting it across his shoulder. His voice rumbled low, steady as the mountains around them. "You'll not touch them again." The words settled like stones. The men laughed, but it was brittle laughter, breaking under the weight of his certainty. One lunged forward, raising his shotgun. The rancher fired first, rifle cracking like thunder. The man dropped, torch spinning into snow, flame smothered in an instant. Chaos exploded. The settlers shouted, firing blindly into the storm-silvered dark. Smoke and gunpowder mixed with snow, choking the air. The rancher moved with brutal precision, a giant forged in violence yet tempered by purpose. He swung the axe when the rifle emptied, cleaving a torch from a hand, sending its bearer sprawling. The women did not cower. One grabbed a fallen lantern, hurling it into the snow where fire flared wild, smoke billowing. The other, trembling but resolute, seized his spare revolver. She fired a single shot, not deadly, but enough to send another man stumbling back, clutching his grazed arm with shock and rage. The storm chose its side. Wind rose, whipping snow into their faces, blinding sightlines. The settlers cursed, stumbling against drifts. The rancher pressed forward, driving them back with the weight of his presence alone. When one lunged with a knife, he caught the wrist, twisted until bone cracked, and shoved the man face first into the snow. Blood spattered against white. The smell of iron thickened. The women clung to each other, their courage fierce even as tears streaked their cheeks. The rancher's chest heaved, cut across the ribs where a bullet had grazed him, yet he did not falter. One man slipped, torch plunging into dry pine stacked against the cabin wall. Flames licked up fast, threatening to devour the sanctuary. The women cried out, scrambling to beat the fire with blankets. The rancher pivoted, seized the torchbearer by his collar, and hurled him into the drift. Snow swallowed him, hissed the fire down to embers. Smoke curled, but the cabin stood. The leader remained, teeth bared, rope swinging in his hand. He charged, whiskey fury driving him reckless. The rancher let the axe drop into the snow, and caught the rope as it snapped toward him. He wrenched it free, looped it once around the man's wrist, and yanked hard. The settler crashed down, breath knocked out, weapon lost. The rancher loomed over him, rope taut in his hands, the irony heavy as the storm. For a moment, it seemed he might finish it the way they had tried to finish the women. But he did not. He let the rope fall, a judgment of contempt sharper than death. "Live," he said, voice raw with fury. "Live with the shame." The man scrambled back, eyes wide, face pale beneath torchlight. He fled into the trees, stumbling over drifts, his laughter long gone. The others followed, broken, their cruelty shattered by resistance they had never expected. The night swallowed them whole. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of the dying fire and the soft sobs of the women. The rancher stood in the snow, chest heaving, blood streaking his skin, axe glinting at his feet. Moonlight silvered the steam rising from his body, as though he were some apparition carved from frost and fury. He turned toward the cabin. The women clutched each other, blankets wrapped tight, their faces streaked with tears yet alive, unbroken. One still held the revolver loosely in her hand, smoke drifting from its barrel. Their eyes met his, and for the first time since he had cut them down, trust shone clear and unhidden. He stepped forward, knees nearly buckling from the wound at his ribs. They rushed to him, supporting his weight as best they could. Together, they staggered into the cabin, leaving the battlefield of snow behind. Inside, the fire still burned, though the air carried smoke from the brief blaze. They pressed him onto the chair, working with frantic hands to stop the bleeding. His head dipped back, vision blurring, but he felt their hands steady on him, not afraid now but certain. The storm beyond the shutters whispered again, carrying the scent of pine and blood, but also something else, quiet, fragile hope. He breathed deep, letting the moment settle, knowing the fight was not over, though victory had been carved from the jaws of night. And as his vision steadied he saw them. Two women kneeling close, their hands over his wound, their unborn children stirring within them, as though the lives of four rested against his single breath. He knew then the war was no longer only his to fight. The cabin smelled of smoke, pine and blood, yet the air carried something different now, an unspoken relief that clung as firmly as the scent of ash. The rancher sat slumped in his chair, chest bound with cloth the women had torn from their blankets, his breath ragged but steady. The worst of the bleeding had stopped, though his skin shone pale beneath the fire's glow. The women moved around him with quiet purpose, no longer shrinking shadows but guardians themselves, tending his wounds as though their own lives depended on the work of their hands. Outside, the snow gleamed under a thin, fragile dawn. No torchlight moved among the trees, no laughter carried on the air. The land seemed scrubbed clean, though the memory of violence lay heavy as the drifts. The women paused often to look at the door, as though still expecting the men to return, but each time they glanced back to him and found assurance in his stillness, in the iron certainty that lived in his eyes even as his body faltered. Hours passed. One woman fed him broth slowly, spoon trembling as she guided it to his lips. He accepted, each swallow pulling him further from the edge. Her sister pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, whispering low in Apache, words that carried a rhythm both soothing and strong. He did not understand, but he recognized prayer when he heard it, a language older than cruelty, older than rope. By evening, strength returned to his frame enough that he rose, refusing to be pinned to the chair. He limped outside, wrapped in his coat now, the women trailing close behind. The snow sparkled beneath a sky washed clean of storm, stars pricking through the dark like 1,000 watching eyes. He gathered wood with slow, deliberate motions, stacking it against the cabin wall. When one of the women reached to help, he let her, handing her the lighter pieces. Together they built the pile higher, as if declaring to the night that they would not be consumed by fire again. In the days that followed, life bent into a new rhythm. The women remained, finding safety in his walls, while he found unexpected company in their presence. They moved about the cabin more freely, no longer clutching the blankets as shields, but as garments of warmth. One swept the floor each morning with calm diligence, while the other tended the stew, humming softly. Their laughter returned faintly at times, cautious but real, a sound so delicate it seemed to heal the very timbers of the cabin. He repaired their shoes with leather scraps, kneeling as they watched him, astonished by the care of a man who asked nothing in return. They, in turn, stitched his shirts, fingers clumsy at first but patient, mending what had been torn. Every act, small and wordless, stitched them together into something larger than survival, something edging toward kinship. At night, when the fire dwindled low, he sometimes caught them watching him. Not with fear, nor with the weight of obligation, but with the quiet gaze of those trying to understand a man who stood against the tide when the world had urged him to stand aside. He bore their eyes without flinching, though he said little, only meeting their looks with the same steady calm that had carried him into the snow the night he cut them down. One evening, he brought in pine boards he had hauled from the shed. He worked with saw and plane, shaping wood into curved slats, smoothing edges with a knife. The women watched, puzzled at first, then slowly realizing what he was making. 2 cradles took shape by the firelight, their forms simple but strong, built from hands scarred by labor yet guided by tenderness. When he set them side by side near the hearth, the women pressed hands to their mouths, tears slipping free without sound. He did not speak, but the message lay plain. These children, when they came, would have a place, a beginning unmarred by cruelty. The days stretched into a fragile peace. The wounds on their bodies healed, the bruises fading into memory, though the marks at their throats lingered like ghostly necklaces. Yet their spirits, once tethered to silence, began to rise. One ventured to teach him a word or two in her tongue, pointing at fire, at bread, at sky. He repeated clumsily and they laughed, the sound unburdened now. The other grew bold enough to sing while tending the stew, her voice lilting, filling the cabin with a melody that seemed to cleanse its walls of every scream they had once held back. But peace in the west was never eternal. One night, as the wind rattled faintly through the pines, a lone gunshot cracked in the distance, echoing across the frozen land. The women froze, eyes wide, hands clutching their bellies. He rose, took his rifle, and stepped to the door. Only silence followed, but it was enough to remind them all that danger never vanished. It only bided its time. He returned inside, set the rifle by the fire, and sat close to them. His presence spoke louder than words. Whatever came, they would face it together. As winter deepened, the bond between them grew unbreakable. The women no longer looked at him as stranger, nor even protector alone, but as something steadier, an anchor. And he, who had once filled his days with silence and wood smoke, found his cabin alive with voices, hands, and the promise of new life. One night, as snow fell soft beyond the windows, the stronger of the 2 women reached for his hand. She placed it gently on her swollen belly, letting him feel the movement of life beneath her skin. His rough palm rested there, and when the child stirred, his chest tightened with something he had no words for. He looked at her, saw her gaze unwavering, and in it the acknowledgement that trust had been rebuilt not through words but through sacrifice. Her sister, watching, smiled faintly, a smile that carried sorrow and hope all at once. The firelight flickered, casting them in amber glow. For the first time in years, the rancher let his hand rest, not as protector alone, but as part of something greater. Not possession, not obligation, family forged by storm, rope, and mercy. The season turned slowly. Spring would come, and with it, new dangers, new reckonings. But as dawn approached that night, the cabin stood warm, alive with breath, and the sound of hearts beating in unison. He knew the world beyond would never forgive what he had done, sheltering those marked by hatred, defying men who had claimed power through cruelty. But as he looked at the women at the cradles waiting by the fire, he understood that forgiveness mattered less than this. The choice to protect, to build, to refuse the rot of violence. The snow whispered outside, endless and quiet. Inside, life grew stronger. And when he finally lay back, eyes heavy, the last thing he saw was the two women leaning close, their hands covering his as though vowing together that he would never stand alone again. The West had written 1,000 tales of vengeance, of men who burned and men who fell. But this night had written something different, of survival, of quiet love, of dignity reclaimed. And somewhere beyond the pines, the remnants of cruelty limped away, broken by the refusal of one man and two women to bow. Their shame would spread faster than fire, while within the cabin, hope smoldered bright as any sunrise. In a land where mercy was rarer than gold, the narrator might have whispered, had one been present. A giant gave it freely, and it saved not 2 lives, but 4 and perhaps even his own. Now the cradles waited, empty but ready, while the fire burned steady, carrying them into a dawn that promised not ease, but a beginning. And to those listening, to those watching, the tale leaves one final truth. In the Wild West, where cruelty howled like winter wind, it was kindness that could silence it. Now if you've carried this far with us, click on the next story waiting for you. It is even deeper, even sharper, and it will stay with you long after the fire dies. Until then, may mercy guide your road.